14:32 hours, February 17th, 1943, North Atlantic, 200 meters below the surface. The creaking of the pressure hull sounded like the groans of a dying giant. Lieutenant Commander Werner Hartmann stared intently at the depth gauge. The needle trembled at 198 meters. Then it happened. A sound every U-boat crewman dreaded. A metallic crash. A hiss. Water. In the hell of 20 atmospheres beneath the waves, while 8 British destroyers circled overhead and 127 depth charges rained down upon them, the pressure hull of U-463 gave way. A leak at 200 meters. The next 47 minutes would determine whether 44 men lived or died. British convoy commander Captain Richard Blackwood, aboard HMS Hesperus, had already sunk 2 U-boats that night. His radio transmission at 13:47 hours to the Admiralty was unequivocal. Quote, "Third U-boat located, depth unknown, commencing attack to destroy." 8 ships of his destroyer squadron circled the suspected location of U-463 like sharks around a wounded fish. Before we continue, if you appreciate documented stories like this, subscribe now. It costs nothing and helps immensely. Let's get back to it. Hartmann was 27 years old, a man from Hamburg, son of a dock worker, who had fought his way through the Naval Academy. His crew trusted him implicitly. 44 men trapped inside a steel cylinder, 67.10 meters long and 6.20 meters wide. At 200 meters, the water pressed against every part of the hull with 20 kilograms per square centimeter. The human skin would burst like an overripe grape under that pressure. Only 28 millimeters of steel separated them from death. U-463 was a Type Psi-C, the workhorse of the German U-boat fleet, built at German works in Kiel, commissioned on April 15, 1942. The official diving depth was 100 meters. The extended operational depth, 230 meters. The theoretical crush depth was between 250 and 300 meters. Hartmann was in a zone that even the engineers considered critical. Every meter further down increased the risk of catastrophic failure exponentially. The chief petty officer engineer, Friedrich Brenner, was the first to discover the leak. In the engine room, Section 4. At a weld seam that could no longer withstand the unimaginable pressure, a jet of water, thin as a pencil, but with a pressure that could have severed a finger, shot into the interior of the boat. Brenner knew instantly what needed to be done, and he also knew that it was impossible, according to all the laws of physics. The British destroyers above them were working with deadly precision. HMS Hesperus led the hunt. Supported by HMS Whitehall, HMS Vanquisher, HMS Volunteer, HMS Watchman, HMS Westcott, HMS Wolverine, and HMS Veteran, 8 ships, 127 depth charges in the first 23 minutes. The pressure waves from each explosion raced through the water at 1,500 meters per second, slamming against the hull of U-463 like the fists of an invisible giant. Inside the boat, there was controlled chaos. The emergency lighting cast red shadows on the pale faces of the men. The smell of sweat, machine oil, and fear mixed with the acrid aroma of chlorine gas rising from the damaged batteries. Hartmann ordered calm. His voice was steady, almost gentle. "Listen," he said. "We will survive this, but only if every man does exactly as I say." Brenner had already begun to attempt the impossible. Using a special alloy of lead and tin that melted at lower temperatures, he wanted to seal the leak. The problem: to weld, he needed heat. Heat created oxygen. Oxygen was more precious than gold at 200 meters. Every breath the 44 men took consumed the limited supply. The oxygen gauge read 14%. Normal would be 21%. At 10%, the men would lose consciousness. At 6%, they would die. The British sonar operator aboard HMS Hesperus, a 23-year-old petty officer named Thomas Williams, heard every sound from U-463. the quiet hum of the electric motors, the occasional clatter of tools. Even the creaking of the pressure hull. He reported to his commander, "Target not moving, possibly damaged. Recommend concentrated attack." Captain Blackwood smiled. A damaged U-boat at that depth was a dead U-boat. He ordered another salvo of 24 depth charges, this time with the depth setting at 200 meters. Brenner worked with a concentration bordering on obsession. Beside him stood Petty Officer Karl Hoffmann, 19 years old, from a small village in Bavaria. Hoffmann held a metal sheet against the jet of water to give Brenner at least a few seconds to work. The water was ice cold, 4 degrees Celsius. Hoffmann's hands went numb, but he held firm. The first soldering attempts failed. The incoming water cooled the seam before it could fuse. Brenner cursed softly. Then an idea came to him. An idea so crazy it just might work. He ordered Hoffmann to soak a rag in diesel and light it. The flame would evaporate the water for a moment. In that moment, a second, maybe 2. Brenner had to make the soldered joint. The idea was absurd. Fire in a U-boat at 200 meters, in a confined space with 44 men already suffering from oxygen deprivation. Any fire safety expert would have declared Brenner insane. But Brenner wasn't a fire safety expert. He was a man who wanted to save his comrades, and sometimes desperate situations require desperate measures. Hoffmann lit the rag. The flame flickered orange and blue. The smell of burning diesel mixed with the already stuffy aroma of the boat. Brenner held the soldering iron ready. His hands did not tremble. Not now. Not at this moment. He had learned in the shipyard in Kiel that a good engineer controls his emotions. His instructors would have been proud. The next depth charge salvo exploded. The boat was shaken like a toy in the hands of an angry child. Light bulbs shattered. A pressure gauge fell from the wall. 2 men tumbled, but no one screamed. No one gave up. Current status, 500 subscribers, 16,000 hours of viewing time. If you'd like to watch regularly, subscribe now. Every subscription counts. On with the story. Hartmann watched the depth gauge. 203 meters. The boat was sinking. Slowly, but inevitably. The incoming water increased the weight. The pumps, normally stabilizing the boat at depth, were nearly useless at this pressure. At 20 atmospheres, the bilge pumps operated at less than 30% efficiency. Every liter of water flooding in had to be fought by the crew with buckets and shovels. A truly absurd notion. 44 U-boat crewmen against the entire North Atlantic. At 14:47 hours, 15 minutes after the initial breach, Friedrich Brenner achieved the impossible. The diesel-soaked rag evaporated the inrushing water for precisely 1.7 seconds. During that sliver of time, he laid down a weld seam, then a second, then a third. The jet of water weakened, then stopped. The leak was sealed, but the crisis wasn't over. Far from it. The U-463 had taken on 3.2 tons of water during the 15-minute ordeal. She now rested at 211 meters, approaching crush depth. The electric motors were running at minimal power to conserve the remaining battery capacity. The oxygen gauge read 11%. The U-boat crewmen were breathing heavily. Some coughed. The chlorine gas from the damaged batteries burned in their lungs. Above, on the surface, Captain Richard Blackwood calculated the situation. His sonar operator reported that the target had sunk deeper. This signified either a direct hit or a malfunction in the German depth control. Either was good. He ordered the destroyer squadron to hold their position, awaiting signs of an upward movement. If the U-boat surfaced, they would be ready. Werner Hartmann faced the most difficult decision of his life. To surface, he had to pump the water from the boat. But the pumps were virtually useless at this depth. He could use compressed air to blow the water from the ballast tanks, but the compressed air was a finite resource. and if it wasn't sufficient to bring them up, they were dead. He could also wait, hoping the destroyer squadron would give up. But with only 11% oxygen, they perhaps had only 90 minutes left, maybe less. He made his decision. "To the Chief Petty Officer Engineer," he commanded. "Blow all ballast tanks. Maximum pressure. We're going up." And then, he continued, "All hands to battle stations. If we surface, we fight!" Friedrich Brenner hesitated for a moment. This was madness. 8 destroyers awaited them. But then he looked into Werner Hartmann's eyes. No fear, no desperation, only determination. He nodded and commenced opening the compressed air valves. The hiss of compressed air filled the Type 7C U-boat. The ballast tanks emptied, slowly, agonizingly slowly. U-463 began to ascend. 210 meters, 205 meters, 200 meters, 195 meters. On the surface, Thomas Williams registered the movement. "Target is rising," he reported. "Quickly!" Richard Blackwood no longer smiled. A surfacing U-boat was more dangerous than a sunken one. It could still fight. He ordered all 8 ships to converge on the anticipated surfacing point. 64 guns trained on a single point in the sea. At 150 meters, something unexpected happened. But first, a flashback to what transpired within the U-463 during those moments. The 44 U-boat crewmen aboard U-463 hailed from all corners of Germany. From Hamburg and Munich, from Berlin and Cologne, from small villages in Bavaria and fishing towns on the Baltic Sea. Each of them possessed a history. Each of them had someone waiting for them. The torpedo operator Heinrich Müller, 22 years old, thought of his fiancée, Greta, in Lübeck. They had planned to marry in the spring of 1943. He wondered if he would even see that spring. The radio operator Otto Schneider, 25, had just learned that his wife was pregnant. He'd received the news 3 days before departure. He was going to be a father, if he survived. And the petty officer, Hans Kruger, the oldest aboard at 41, thought of his son who had just been drafted. Kruger had lived through the First World War as a youth. Now he was fighting in the Second. And his son, somewhere on the Eastern Front. 3 generations at war. It seemed to him at times that Germany would never cease fighting. These men, with their hopes and their fears, were now 150 meters below the surface, heading upward, while 8 enemy ships were waiting to kill them. Werner Hartmann had studied the destroyers' movement patterns. He had counted their sonar pings. He knew they were forming a circular formation. He also knew that ASDIC was less effective in shallow water, and he knew something the British did not. Below the thermocline, a layer of differing water temperature around 80 meters, the sonar beam became distorted. It was like a ray of light refracting through a pane of glass. If he steered quickly enough through this layer and then altered course, he could confuse the British sensors. He ordered a course change, 90 degrees to starboard. Simultaneously, he ordered the speed reduced to dead slow. The electric motors hummed quietly. The U-boat glided through the thermocline like a ghost. Thomas Williams lost the signal. "Target lost," he reported, his voice uncertain for the first time. "I've lost it," Richard Blackwood cursed. He ordered a sweep search. All 8 destroyers began systematically searching the area, but the sea is vast, and a U-boat that is not moving is almost invisible. Werner Hartmann ordered absolute silence. No movement, no noise, even breathing was controlled. 44 U-boat crewmen, crammed into a steel cylinder, waited. The oxygen gauge now read 9%. Some men began to sway. Heads grew heavy. Thoughts slowed. Time stretched into infinity. At 15:19 hours, 47 minutes after the initial leak, Richard Blackwood reached a decision. The convoy could wait no longer. The U-boat threat to the merchant ships was too grave. he ordered the search abandoned. Quote from the war diary of HMS Hesperus, 15-19 hours, search abandoned, presumed enemy loss due to depth damage, no confirmation possible, resuming convoy escort. Werner Hartmann heard the screw noises of the destroyers receding. He waited another 30 minutes. Then, when he was certain they were alone, he ordered the surfacing. The sea was empty. The hatches were opened. Fresh air rushed into the boat. U-boat crewmen, who had just been on the verge of unconsciousness, inhaled deeply. Some wept. Others laughed. Most did both at the same time. Werner Hartmann climbed onto the bridge. The sun was setting. The sky was red and orange. He thought of his wife, Helga, in Hamburg, of his little son, Werner Jr., 3 years old. He hadn't seen her in 8 months. He wondered if he'd ever see her again. Brenner approached him. The chief petty officer engineer was exhausted. His hands were shaking, but there was something in his eyes that Hartmann recognized. Pride. They had achieved the impossible. "Lieutenant Commander," Brenner said quietly, "the repair will hold, but we need a shipyard. Urgently." Hartmann nodded. "Course Lorient," he commanded. "Full speed." The next 3 days were an odyssey. U-463 crept through enemy waters, diving at every aircraft signal, evading British patrols. The temporary repair held, but barely. With each dive, they heard the ominous creak of the weld seam. But it held. On February 20th, 1943, at 06:47 hours, U-463 reached the U-boat bunker in Lorient. The massive concrete bunker, built to protect German U-boats from Allied bombing raids, loomed like a fortress out of the grey morning. The crew was greeted with flowers. A photographer took pictures for the newsreel. Naval music played. Officers saluted, but the men had no eyes for the fanfare. They only wanted one thing: solid ground beneath their feet. The naval physician, examining the crew, noted in his report, severe signs of exhaustion in all 44 men, several cases of mild chlorine gas poisoning, frostbite on hands in 7 men, including the chief petty officer engineer. Recommend 14 days of shore leave for the entire crew. Hartmann stood on the pier, looking back at his boat. Brenner's temporary repair was not visible from the outside, but he knew it was there, a patch of solder and improvisation that had saved 44 lives. The shipyard workers would later analyze it and shake their heads, realizing that this repair should not have worked, according to any textbook. Brenner came to him. The engineer's hands were bandaged. The cold of the Atlantic water had taken its toll, but his eyes shone. "We made it, Lieutenant Commander," he said quietly. "We actually made it." Hartmann just nodded. Some things need no words. The British Admiralty only learned weeks later that U-463 had escaped. Captain Blackwood wrote in his personal diary, "We had them. We definitely had them. But they escaped. How? I will never understand. These German U-boat guys are either crazy or geniuses. Maybe both." What Blackwood didn't know was that the repair that Brenner had carried out at a depth of 200 meters was later analyzed by engineers from the German works in Kiel. Their verdict was unequivocal. Quote, "A repair of this kind, under these conditions, is impossible, according to all known parameters of material science. The fact that it succeeded is either a miracle or a testament to exceptional skills under extreme pressure. The technical details are remarkable. The pressure at a depth of 200 meters is 20.7 atmospheres, or 303 pounds per square inch. A leak the size of a pencil lets in about 75 liters of water per minute. In 15 minutes, that's 1,125 liters, or 1.125 tons. Brenner worked against this flood with a soldering iron, normally used for electronics work. The solder alloy he used was a special mixture of 60% tin and 40% lead, which melts at 183 degrees Celsius. The ambient temperature in the boat was about 35 degrees Celsius, due to the body heat of the 44 men. The incoming water was 4 degrees. The temperature difference made soldering nearly impossible. Brenner's solution, to use a burning diesel-soaked rag, was ingenious in its simplicity. The diesel flame reaches temperatures of about 300 degrees Celsius. For 1.7 seconds, the time it takes for the water to flow through the flame and evaporate. He had a window for the repair. He used every second. To be honest, the channel needs 1,000 subscribers to continue to grow. Currently, we have 500. If you like this detailed historical work, subscribe now. Every subscription brings us closer to more archival research and deeper documentation. The story of U-463 became part of the training program for U-boat engineers after the war, not only in Germany, but also at the US Navy and the Royal Navy. The lessons were clear. First, the limits of technology are often further than we think. Second, under extreme pressure, people can achieve feats that seem impossible in the laboratory. Third, camaraderie and trust are as important as technical knowledge. Werner Hartmann survived the war. He was captured on May 3, 1945, and spent 18 months in British captivity as a prisoner of war. After his release, he returned to Hamburg and worked as an engineer in the shipyard industry. He remarried after Helga died of tuberculosis in 1947. His son, Werner Jr., later became a naval officer himself, though in the German Federal Navy, Bundesmarine. Friedrich Brenner, the chief petty officer engineer, emigrated to Canada in 1951. He worked for a shipbuilding company in Vancouver. In an interview in 1978, he was asked about the repair at 200 meters. His answer was typically modest. "I did what had to be done. Any of us would have done it." "We were a team." Karl Hoffmann, the 19-year-old petty officer who held the metal sheet against the jet of water, did not survive the war. U-463 was sunk on August 14, 1943, during a bombing raid in the port of Bordeaux. It was an attack by the Royal Air Force. Lancaster bombers dropped their deadly cargo on the German U-boat bunkers. U-463 was in the dock for repairs. Hoffmann was on board when the bombs fell. He was 20 years old. His mother in Bavaria received the news 3 weeks later, an official letter, cold and impersonal. Her son Karl had fallen for the fatherland. The details were classified. She never learned that 6 months earlier, her son had held a sheet of metal against death at a depth of 200 meters. She never learned that he had saved the lives of 44 men. Brenner only learned of Hoffmann's death after the war. In his 1978 interview, he said with a broken voice, "Karl was a boy with numb hands and a brave heart. Without him, we would all have died, and then he died anyway. It's not right. Nothing about war is right." Heinrich Müller, the torpedo man, who had thought of his fiancée Greta, survived. He returned to Lübeck and married her in June 1945. They had 4 children. He lived to be 87 years old. Otto Schneider, the radio operator, whose wife was pregnant, also survived. He got to know his son. He named him Frederick, after the chief petty officer engineer who had saved all their lives. The story of U-463 is more than just a war story. It's a testament to human capability under inhumane conditions. 44 U-boat crewmen, locked in a steel coffin 650 feet below the surface, surrounded by enemies, with dwindling air and a leak that by all the rules of physics should have killed them. And yet, they survived. The question that remains: what enables people to achieve such feats? Is it training? Is it instinct? Is it something deeper? Something we can't measure? The answer, perhaps, lies in the words of Friedrich Brenner himself. In that interview from 1978, he also said, "In the moment the leak occurred, I didn't have time for fear. I only had time for the solution. The fear came later, much later, years later." The psychological consequences for the survivors were significant. Many suffered from what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder, nightmares, panic attacks, the inability to be in confined spaces. Werner Hartmann himself reported in a letter to a former comrade in 1952, "I can no longer use elevators. The thought of being trapped is unbearable." But they rarely spoke about it. It was a generation that had learned to bury their wounds. The German U-boat crewmen of World War II carried their experiences like invisible scars. Only decades later, as historians began to record their stories, did the full details come to light. The British side of the story is equally revealing. Captain Richard Blackwood led a long life as a retired naval officer in Cornwall after the war. In his memoirs, published in 1965, he dedicated an entire chapter to the incident of February 17, 1943. He wrote, "Of all the U-boats I hunted, this is the only one that gives me nightmares, not because we couldn't sink it, but because, to this day, I don't understand how it escaped. At that depth, with that damage, it should have sunk. The fact that it didn't shakes my understanding of what is possible." Thomas Williams, the sonar operator who lost the signal, left the Navy after the war and became a fisherman in a small village on the coast of Cornwall. He never spoke about his time on the HMS Hesperus, not with his wife, not with his children. The sea that fed him as a fisherman was the same sea in which he had tried to kill men. That irony did not escape him. His son recounted in an interview in 2001, "My father never talked about the war, but sometimes at night I'd hear him mumbling in his sleep, always the same thing. I lost it. I lost it." I never knew what he had lost. Only after he died, when I went through his old papers, did I find a report about February 17, 1943. That's when I understood. Williams died in 1989 at the age of 69. His headstone simply reads, "A fisherman who loved the sea." Of the German U-boat, he had nearly sunk that day. No one in his village knew. The thermocline tactic that Werner Hartmann employed was later incorporated into NATO training materials. It's one of the many techniques that were studied by both sides during the Cold War. The Americans called it layer evasion. The Soviets had their own term for it. But the basic idea remained the same: use nature against technology. Interestingly, Hartmann's maneuver was also used in the 1981 film Das Boot, although the film is based on the book by Lothar Günther Buchheim, and not on the experiences of U-463. Buchheim himself was a war correspondent on U-96 and experienced similar situations. The parallels between the various U-boat stories are striking. It was almost as if all German U-boat crewmen shared the same experiences, shared the same fears, had the same dreams and nightmares. It was one of many innovations born from the experiences of World War II. The irony that a German tactic was adopted by their former enemies did not go unnoticed. But the story of U-463 isn't just a story of tactics and technology. It's a story of people, of Werner Hartmann, who kept his cool when everything around him descended into chaos, of Friedrich Brenner, who accomplished the impossible with his bare hands, of Karl Hoffmann, who held a metal sheet against death with numb fingers, and of 41 other men whose names gathered dust in the archives, but who were just as important that day in the depths of the Atlantic. Each of them had a family, a mother waiting for news, a sweetheart writing letters, children who missed their father. The war under the sea was anonymous and dark, but the people who fought it were alive and real. The U-boat losses in February 1943 were devastating. 19 German U-boats were sunk that month. 954 men died. The names of those boats read like a graveyard: U-69, U-187, U-201, U-205, U-225, U-268, U-442, U-509, U-529, U-553, U-562, U-606, U-609, U-623, U-624, U-649, U-656, U-707, and U-623. Each boat a world unto itself, each boat a family that would never be together again. U-463 could have been one of those boats. One of those 954 lives could have been Werner Hartmann, or Friedrich Brenner, or Karl Hoffmann, who would ultimately die just 6 months later. February 1943 marked a turning point in the U-boat war. The Allied forces had begun to gain the upper hand. New radar systems, improved sonar technology, long-range aircraft that closed the so-called Atlantic Gap. The happy times, as the U-boat crewmen called the years 1940 and 1941, were long gone. Now, every patrol was a death sentence on probation. Admiral Karl Dönitz, the commander of the U-boat force, knew about these losses. He knew that he was sending men to their deaths. But the war demanded sacrifices, and so they continued to sail out again and again until the sea took them or peace came. But on that February 17th, 650 feet down, the men of U-463 had defeated death, at least for that day, at least for those 47 minutes. At least until next time, what remains of their story, documents in archives, war diaries from both sides, the memoirs of Richard Blackwood, an interview with Friedrich Brenner, and the oral histories of the families. Hartmann's grandson, an architect in Munich, told me in 2019, "My grandfather rarely spoke about the war. But this story, the story of the leak at 200 meters, he told me once. It was Christmas 1967. I was 12 years old. He was sitting by the fireplace, sipping his mulled wine, and suddenly he began to tell the tale. His voice was calm, almost matter-of-fact, but his hands, they were trembling. When he finished, he simply said, 'I wanted you to know what people are capable of doing for each other.' Then he got up and went to bed. This story isn't just for history buffs. It's for anyone who has ever faced a seemingly impossible challenge, for anyone who ever thought, it can't be done. Because if 44 men at 200 meters deep with 20 atmospheres of pressure and 8 destroyers above them can repair a leak and escape, then maybe, just maybe, nothing is truly impossible. It only requires courage, skill, and the unwavering conviction that giving up is not an option. These aren't just statistics from dusty archives. These are the moments that decided the fate of millions. Real soldiers, real fear, real consequences. These stories must never be forgotten. If these historical truths are important to you, then support this channel with YouTube's Super Thanks, the golden heart below. Each Super Thanks allows me to spend weeks in archives, digitizing rare documents, interviewing surviving witnesses. The story of U-463 ended on August 14th, 1943. But its legacy lives on, in the training materials of navies worldwide, in the memories of the families, and now, in this very narrative. 200 meters below the surface, 20 atmospheres of pressure, 8 destroyers, 127 depth charges, 1 leak, 44 men, 47 minutes, and a miracle that by all the laws of physics shouldn't have happened. But it did, because people, when push comes to shove, are more than the sum of their limitations. This is the story of U-463, the story of a crew that repaired a leak at 200 meters and escaped 8 destroyers. A story that should never be forgotten. If you have family members who served in the U-boat service or know stories from that time, Please share them in the comments. Every memory shared is a memory that isn't lost. These stories connect us to our past and teach us what people are capable of doing for each other when everything is on the line.